So this is actually take two of my attempt to respond to your takeaways. I tried to put something together last week, and basically my laptop corrupted the file, and I wasn't able to put it on YouTube, and I decided to give up and try again today. Just a couple of things about this. I had some interesting responses to the takeaways. One, there's a couple of you who turned something like click turn in on the assignment, but never left a comment or did anything. You're not getting credit. I'm just going to send that back to you. Then there's a couple of you who put comments on the main like instruction page for the assignment, and that's what I wanted. And then there's a handful of you that put them on the private assignment thing. And well, I'm going to give you credit for that. I would actually really love it if we could put all of the comments in one place on the main page for it, because that would enable us to be able to play off of each other a little bit and respond to each other's comments, which is something that I was kind of hoping for. To have it almost mimic a class discussion, if you will. So with that, I'm going to go through each comment, talk about it a little bit, talk about some of my own takeaways, and then we'll call it good. So first one I want to talk about here comes from Kylie. It's on our main page here. She says the two things stood out to her. First thing here is that it starts off showing part of this march from Selma to Montgomery, which was a guess on your part, and you're correct. It's at the bridge outside Selma, which is a very famous showdown in the civil rights movement, which is part of why they start with that. So I would agree it's incredibly fitting. It is one of the worst examples of police brutality during the civil rights movement. One of the things that you'll notice that is highlighted well in the book is that protesters protesting for equality, essentially, is what they're demanding in their protests. Nonviolent protesters are often met by police officers, sheriffs, other authority figures, or sometimes just angry citizens with violence. It's always a violent response, it like clockwork. And we'll talk a little bit about like nonviolent workshops, things like that in a second with your second comment. But Selma is one of the worst examples. It's just you come off of this bridge, or if you don't come off of this bridge, we're going to beat the hell out of you kind of approach to things. The response of violence wound up backfiring on Southern authority figures. They were under the impression that if they just beat people up enough that they would quit. And what really happened is the brutality and the violence winds up getting documented and shown on the news every night. And when there's video of somebody behaving in a violent way, they really look like human garbage. Like they really just look terrible, maybe even more so than they are. But it really highlights just how bad the South was. I think a lot of Northern whites specifically were pretty ignorant about how violent and how awful it would have been to be an African American person living in the South. And something that doesn't give you the full experience, but might give you a bridge to understand that experience is watching the nightly news and seeing these police officers. People are supposed to serve and protect and take care of their population. Instead, just unleashing some of the most horrible violence on people who haven't raised a hand against them, who are just protesting for the right to be seen as a full-fledged citizen. So getting into your second comment here, so when they were doing nonviolence workshops, they would call each other names, try to dehumanize each other, so they knew what to expect when they were protesting and make sure they could ignore it and remain nonviolent. Well done nonviolent protest the innovator of this is of course Gandhi, really highlights the brutality of the oppressor. That's what they're trying to do. So getting back to my discussion about video, if you see two people fighting on video, it looks like two people fighting. If you see one person just taking an absolute beating on video, the person delivering that beating looks like an absolute monster. And one of the things that the civil rights movement did, or got the benefit of, it's not like it was a plot or a scheme, but they really highlighted the violence of the oppressor by engaging in nonviolent tactics. Like, I'm not going to comply with your order because it's not just, but I'm also not going to hit back. And I'm going to have you make an ethical choice to harm somebody who intends you absolutely zero harm, and see if you can handle that. So, I thought about it a long time, and I wonder about my own patience, and I wonder about my own self-control in a situation like that. And I genuinely think that in a lot of these cases, I would have fought back, and I'm not sure I would have been so great for this movement. I'm not a violent person, but if somebody decks me, I'm awfully tempted to deck them back. And just knowing that about myself, when I turn around and I apply it to the folks in this movement, it's very clear that they have worked incredibly hard to have an incredibly high level of patience and an incredibly high level of self-control. Next comment here, Ian Stevenson. So one of the biggest takeaways from the first book for you was a subtle line. I love this on Friday. I'm mad that my original video didn't post. Subtle line by a white man during the student walk-ins. Where am I supposed to eat lunch? Right? A lot of times, Americans can be incredibly self-absorbed, and you see it in here, right? Where the big concern from the person on the sidelines here is not that a fellow American has not received his full civil rights, but instead, he's just not happy because he doesn't get to eat lunch at his favorite spot that day, right? You write that you believe this line was subtly placed in the comic for ironic comedy. I would agree. The line is representative of the hypocritical beliefs of white Southerners at the time. I would say that these white Southerners see themselves as having a certain set of privileges that are not there for everybody else, and that they're fine with that. And so when that privilege is somehow threatened, that's when they are frustrated, that's when they are angry, that's when they are upset. Regardless of the fact that that privilege comes at the expense of somebody else's humanity and rights, right? Another takeaway from your first book, the protesters' treatment by police, we just talked about that in great detail. Important theme in the comic where they were arrested for wanting basic, ethical treatment here. I think that some mistreatment of African Americans historically, as represented in the comic, can still be equated to the modern police mistreatment of the African American community in modern America. I would tend to agree. And in fact, I think, a book like this, which highlights historical mistreatment, starts to build in you the understanding of why this is such a problem and why so many people are so concerned. You definitely, when we're studying history, obviously we're studying it with the express purpose of using it to understand our current surroundings. And I'm definitely looking for that thought process. I'm looking for somebody to look at this historical mistreatment and then look at current examples of mistreatment and go, wow, maybe things have changed a little bit, but have they really changed that much? And I think that's a fair question to ask, and it's one that as Americans, if we're really trying to live up to the ideals of what it means to be an American and have these ideals as the country does, be a nation based on ideals, then we have to keep asking that question over and over and over again. Otherwise, we're not good Americans, right? So I love that you're asking that question. I love that that's your thought process. That's what we should be doing. It'll take me just a second here to get into some other student comments. Finding. So these were private, and I'm not going to name said students, but I do want to address their comments. So this one says there was a person who was yelling at the group of African American protesters at the restaurant said, "Go back to Africa." She mentions finding it funny because African Americans were kidnapped from Africa and now they're being told to go back. Um, Funny, yes. Also highlights something that has been a problem in terms of all Americans being treated as first class citizens, in that there's a healthy chunk of Americans who don't believe that everybody is a first class citizen or deserves first class citizenship rights. Despite the ideals that our country was founded on, there's a chunk of people who will look at other folks saying, "Hey, I just want a place at the table. I just want to be treated as an equal," see that as a threat, and respond to it in such a way. So go back to Africa, go back to this place, go back to this place, because you're not a true American, but I am. That kind of approach is one of the ways, I don't know if you heard that, but that was a lot of thunder. One of the ways that Americans with the privilege of being treated as first class citizens have denied that equal treatment to people who are not being treated the way they should be. That's a very classic response. Another one here. African American folks are sitting at a restaurant counter. White policemen come in and beat them. They've done nothing wrong, being beaten for no reason. They're then arrested, taken to jail for doing nothing but getting beat up. They didn't even fight back because they believed in nonviolent protest. It just doesn't seem right to me and doesn't seem fair to anyone. I just kept thinking why everyone had so much hate for African American folks, and I couldn't come up with anything. I can't come up with anything either, my friend. They were not doing anything violent, yet they were being beaten and arrested. The power structure in the South is such that it will, at the time, and I think in some places now, will respond with violence to anybody who demands equality, right? In this case, the demand is being made in the absolute most peaceful way possible, and it's still, this is still the response. So, I can't find a place in my heart to have any kind of anger or hate at somebody to this way. I have trouble understanding why other white folks behave this way. So Cody, Cody, I'm with you. That was your comment. And yeah, I'm there too. I don't understand the fear or the anger or the resentment. Even though I understand that it's very real and that people do face it, I don't get the origins of it myself. I have tried my entire life to try to figure it out because that would be a way of stopping it. And I can't understand it. Another student here. African American lives were very hard during this time. They weren't treated fairly, didn't have equal rights. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a very important part in the civil rights movement. One of the things I like about the book is it actually drifts a little bit away from Martin Luther King Jr., though he's a principal figure. The main focus is, of course, John Lewis, who's a less well-known but nevertheless incredibly important activist. There's also a ton of other folks that get name dropped in there. Rosa Parks is one, Stokely Carmichael is another, Malcolm X is in there briefly. We don't get a chance to see him, but for a few pages in there. Something I just want to touch on here is that it could feel like this is happening a long time ago. My dad was born in 55 and my mom was born in 56. Which means that they are elementary school age children when all of these events and the comic books that you guys are reading are happening. Those are my parents, and they're older, but they're not old. They're not quite senior citizens yet, and I'm in my 30s, and I don't think of myself as old. And I bring that up to say this didn't happen a long time ago. This happened in the historical equivalent of last week. This is incredibly recent history that is still incredibly raw in the minds of people who lived it. John Lewis is still alive. He's still a congressman from Georgia, and is a very highly respected one. He's one of my favorite people in Congress. So this is all incredibly recent, and just to further drive the point home, you had a couple of dudes in I believe, was it Georgia? It was Georgia, yeah. Attack an African American gentleman who was jogging. And that made national news last week because the guys that did it were charged, rightfully so, with murder. But they still felt licensed to go out and harass and become violent with an African American person based solely on their hate, prejudice, and a poor assumption of what that person was doing. So to say during this time, it's not an incorrect term. It's definitely, you were very correct. African American lives were very hard during this time. That is a true statement. There's significant evidence to suggest that these folks' lives are still hard. That there's still an incredible amount of racism in the world. That it still negatively affects individuals' lives, and we find examples of that every day. Something a little more close to home, maybe. About 5 or 6 years ago, my students at Los Molinos and I looked at a story about a segregated prom at a high school in Mississippi. That was still happening. There was a white prom and a black prom at these schools, and that was mid 2000s, y'all. That was just a few years ago. So I think sometimes when we study history, it can be really easy to go, well, that happened a long time ago, and the world isn't like that now. And I would say there is a significant amount of evidence to suggest that the world is still like this in some ways. Now, the text itself, the comic book itself, is wrapped up in President Obama's inauguration. That's presented as John Lewis at the inauguration, looking back at some of the events in his own life. And so that does suggest progress. That does suggest that the country has changed at least enough for someone, an African-American gentleman, to be elected president. That does suggest progress. So I think we can have an academic discussion on the nature of that progress and the extent of that progress, but to say it is complete would be a false statement. Okay? Until an African-American dude can just jog through a neighborhood like any other person and not feel threatened and not be the focus of violence for doing nothing more than keep it in good shape, I don't know that we've made all the progress that we could. Right? Something to think about as you read through this. I have one more here, and this one just questions, again, the nature of racism. I'm going to summarize this one a little bit. Questions the nature of racism and its origins, and why people have to be so terrible to each other. I don't see why people have to be so rude, but they are, or they were. I would say it's more than rude. It's violent and fearful. And I'm not sure, again, to the origins. I have my own guesses, but I have trouble understanding why white people at the time felt like they had to behave that way. I understand the historical beginnings of it and all that, but I cannot put myself in the mind of somebody with that much hate in their heart, like you guys are having trouble with right now. I guess the real point is it's real. It affects people's lives. It makes people's lives incredibly difficult. And if you can see it, and if you can see it from John Lewis's perspective, maybe your generation can do a good job or a better job of fixing this problem than generations before you, right? It's another reason why we learn history, is to give you guys the tools to be able to make positive change in your country and in your community for things that have historically been a problem. Okay. So that's the comments that I got. I think that's everybody. I'm doing a double check here. So I'm going to pop this video up on YouTube and share it with you guys. And it's basically just a response to your comments. There's not going to be an assignment with it. It's an opportunity for us to have a little bit of back and forth, because we're not in the classroom. We can't do that right now. So please make sure you share any questions you have with me. And this is going up on Monday. Wednesday, we have more takeaways that I'm going to go over that are due. So you want to make sure you get those done. And please put them on the main comment section for the assignment, so we can see what everybody's thinking and respond to each other's comments and have some thoughtful discussion on this. It's as close as we can get to what I really want to do with it. Also, I'm hoping you're enjoying this. The artwork is beautiful. It's John Lewis's real story. There are very few people in American history that I respect as much as John Lewis. So it's a great opportunity to see a great American make change in the world and in their community. So with that, stay safe, hang in there, and I'll post something else here later this week.